Let me paint you a picture. So there was a young man from Lagos. He did not come from money. His family had no connections. And he started hustling from a very young age, moving around, trying to find a way to leave the trenches. And then somewhere along the line, there was a dramatic shift. Suddenly, he's living in a penthouse apartment in Dubai. He drives a white Rolls Royce, has a Ferrari and a Bentley, and his closet's full of designer everything. He's flying private, and is posting all of this on Instagram. He had 2 million followers watching him, admiring, and wondering how. His name on the internet was Hush Puppy. His real name is Ramon Abbas Olorunwa. And in June 2020, the FBI and Interpol arrested him in that Dubai penthouse. He was extradited to the United States, and in November 2022, a judge in Los Angeles sentenced him to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. 11 years. Not for armed robbery, not for dealing drugs, not for murder, for moving money. So today's question is simple. What exactly is money laundering? And why does the world treat it like it's one of the most serious financial crimes in existence? I am Angelo, and this is the Clarity Podcast, where we take the things everyone talks about and yet nobody fully understands, and break them down until they make sense. Today, money laundering, the real mechanics behind it, step by step. Let us get into it. Now, before we go any further, I need to say something clearly. This episode is not a tutorial. I am not here to teach you how to launder money. And if that is what you came for, I'm going to have to disappoint you. And also gently suggest that you close this app, go outside, touch grass, and rethink some of your life decisions. What this episode is actually about is awareness. Because here's the thing about money laundering that most people do not realize. You do not have to be a criminal to get caught up in it. You just have to be uninformed. The person who opens a bank account for someone else because it is just a favor, or the person who receives a transfer they cannot explain and spends it without asking questions, or even the business owner whose account is being used as a pass-through without their knowledge. These are real scenarios, and they sometimes happen to real Nigerians. And the law does not always distinguish cleanly between willing participants and uninformed ones. So understanding how money laundering works is how you recognize when someone is trying to use you for it. That is the real purpose of this episode. Know it so nobody can use you for it. So what is money laundering? Now, the simplest definition is that money laundering is the process of making illegally obtained money appear to have come from a legitimate source. So you take dirty money, you wash it until it looks clean. Now, the name money laundering comes from the Prohibition era in 1920s America. You can also call this Al Capone's era, because during this time, gangsters like Al Capone were generating enormous amounts of illegal cash from bootlegging and crime, but they could not spend it or bank it without explaining where it came from. And so they bought cash-intensive businesses, including laundromats, and they mixed their criminal proceeds with legitimate revenue. The laundromats cleaned the money, and so the name stuck. Now, the core problem money laundering solves is simple. If you steal 10 million naira, you cannot just deposit it in a bank and start buying property. The bank will report it. In fact, tax authorities will investigate you, and also law enforcement will ask questions. The money exists, but you cannot use it freely without a story that explains where it came from. Laundering creates that story. And the scale of money laundering globally is almost incomprehensible. The United Nations estimates that between 800 billion and 2 trillion US dollars are laundered every year. Now, to put that in context, Nigeria's entire GDP is approximately $400 billion. So, the global annual laundering figure is multiple times the total economic output of this entire country. And less than 1% of that money is ever seized by law enforcement. So that tells you that the system is comprehensively losing the fight against money laundering. Now, how does money laundering actually work? Every money laundering operation in the world moves through 3 stages. The first stage is called placement. The second stage, layering. And the third stage is called integration. Now, every money laundering operation in the world, from the smallest local scheme to the most sophisticated international operation, has to pass through these 3 stages. If you have watched Ozark on Netflix, you have actually seen all 3 stages depicted with remarkable accuracy. The entire show is built around Marty Bird being forced to launder cartel money through Missouri businesses. He used a funeral home, a riverboat casino, a lakeside resort, and he used all these as laundering vehicles. The mechanics in that show are far more realistic than most people realize. So you can actually keep that in mind as I walk you through these stages. Now, the first stage, which is placement. Now, this stage is the most dangerous stage because it is when illegal cash first tries to enter the legitimate financial system. And it is dangerous because it is the most visible stage. Here, unexplained cash starts appearing where it should not be. Now, the classic technique used in placement is called structuring, or you can also call it smurfing. So basically, what you do is that you take a large amount and you break it into smaller deposits below the reporting threshold. For example, in the United States, banks must report any cash transaction above $10,000. So what a money launderer does in this situation is that they send 20 different people to 20 different banks, and each of them deposits $9,900, which is just below the limit. And now this does not trigger any reports. Now, another means or another technique for placements is the use of cash-intensive businesses. Places like restaurants, nightclubs, car washes, casinos. Businesses like this where large amounts of cash flow naturally and daily. What you do is that you inflate the reported revenue, mix criminal cash with legitimate cash, and suddenly the business reports higher income and the dirty money is inside the system with a plausible cover story. In Nigeria specifically, the large informal cash economy and the enormous proportion of legitimate commerce businesses that happen entirely in cash makes this placement stage significantly easier than in countries with more formalized systems. It is one of the structural vulnerabilities that keeps Nigeria appearing on international watch lists. Now, the second stage, layering. Once the money is inside the system, the goal of this stage is distance and complexity. You create as many transactions as possible between the dirty source and the final destination. Things like wire transfers between multiple accounts across multiple countries, the use of shell companies, which are businesses that exist legally on paper but conduct no real activities. So you use these shell companies to move money between themselves. You can also purchase luxury items like cars, jewelry, art. And there's also the use of cryptocurrency, which is what you do is basically transfer funds through multiple wallets. Now, the goal of this stage is to make an investigator's job feel like untangling a ball of thread that has been knotted deliberately across 15 countries. By the time they trace transaction 17, the first 10 have already dissolved through entities that technically no longer exist. Now, this is exactly where Hush Puppy's operation lived. He used shell companies, fake escrow accounts, wire transfers across multiple jurisdictions, and it took coordinated effort from Interpol, FBI, and United Arab Emirates authorities working together to unravel it. The truth is, that level of international cooperation is expensive, rare, and not available for the majority of laundering operations that never gets that attention. And now the third stage, Integration. So integration is the finish line. Here, the money re-enters the legitimate economy in a form that now appears completely clean. The most common vehicle globally used in integration is real estate. You buy property with layered funds, you hold it, and you sell it. And the proceeds from these sales are now provably legitimate. Now, luxury goods also work the same way. You buy a Ferrari, you sell it, and you receive clean money. And there's also a technique called a back-to-back loan. Now, how this works is that you deposit laundered money into an offshore bank, and now the bank gives you a loan for the same amount. You repay the loan from your legitimate income. Now, the repayment creates a clean paper trail, and you have effectively paid yourself back with your own dirty money while generating a perfectly legal financial record. This is a simple, effective, and deeply frustrating technique for investigators. Hush Puppy's Dubai lifestyle, the flashy cars, the designer wardrobes, the private jets, the penthouse, all of this was integration. Every luxury purchase was dirty money he was converting into assets. The FBI even described him as one of the most prolific money launderers in the world. By his own admission, he laundered over 300 million US dollars in 18 months. Now, bringing it home to Nigeria specifically, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the EFCC, in recent times have had a few wins and also some failures. Earlier this year, the former Accountant General of the Federation was sentenced to 72 years in prison on 9 counts of money laundering. And currently, the former Attorney General of the Federation, Abubakar Malami, is standing trial on 17 counts of money laundering, totaling 8.7 billion naira. And the charges involves alleged use of corporate entities and real estate to conceal funds. He denies the charges. The court will decide. But the EFCC alone cannot fix the systemic problem. A review of 393 financial crime cases involving public officials in Nigeria between 2013 and 2026 shows that fewer than 40% have reached final judgment, and more than 60% are still pending in courts. Some have been in the system for over a decade. And here is the consequence that most Nigerians never connect to money laundering, but should. Nigeria has repeatedly appeared on grey lists maintained by the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global anti-money laundering watchdog. Now, being grey-listed means international banks treat Nigerian transactions as higher risk. They tend to charge more for correspondent banking services. Now, those costs are passed to Nigerian businesses and individuals doing completely legitimate transactions. You may need to send or receive international transfers. Your bank pays more to maintain correspondent relationships abroad. Now, the criminals are creating a tax that every honest Nigerian absorbs every single day. And this is why money laundering is not an abstract crime. It is one whose costs are distributed across an entire economy and paid by people who had nothing to do with it in the first place. Now, there are two things that I think are worth mentioning before we end this episode. The first is, how does cryptocurrency play into money laundering? Now, modern money laundering is increasingly cryptocurrency driven. The pseudonymity of blockchain, which means that transactions are being recorded by wallet addresses and not by name. This makes tracing significantly harder than traditional banking. There are also mixing services that scramble transaction trails and also converting rapidly between different cryptocurrencies across multiple blockchains adds further layers. Now, there was the Binance Nigeria case in 2024, where the Nigerian government alleged that billions were flowing through the platform in ways that were destabilizing the naira. And this is the most prominent recent example of how crypto and Nigerian financial crime intersect at scale. But here's the double edge. Every blockchain transaction is permanently and publicly recorded. That record never disappears. Now, once law enforcement connects a wallet address to a real person, and the truth is they are getting much better at this, the entire transaction history of that wallet is visible and usable as evidence. The blockchain, in this case, is simultaneously the launderer's preferred tool and also their most permanent paper trail. Now, the second thing I think is worth mentioning is the enablers of money laundering. Now, one of the shows I love, Better Call Saul, actually gets this part very correctly. Money laundering at scale does not happen without professionals. People like lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, bankers. These people provide the infrastructure for money laundering knowingly or unknowingly. Now, in November 2025, a Nigerian court ruled that lawyers are no longer exempt from anti-money laundering reporting obligations. If a lawyer has a client whose wealth makes no sense and asks too few questions, they are now legally exposed. But the more immediate risk for the average listener is simpler than that, being a money mule. Sometimes people are recruited knowingly or unknowingly to receive and transfer money on behalf of someone else. The pitch is always some variation of just allow this money to pass through your account, I will give you a cut. Or a job offer that involves receiving payments and forwarding the money to someone else. Now, these are placement and layering operations using people as the vehicle. And when the authorities eventually trace the money, it is in your account they find it. I did not know is not a defense. The EFCC does not always have the patience or the resources to fully investigate the chain. The person whose account was used can find themselves prosecuted regardless of intent. If someone you do not know well is asking you to receive money on their behalf, you better run. This is the single most actionable thing this episode can actually give you. So, how does dirty money get clean? In 3 stages. First, you place it inside the system through cash businesses, structuring, or informal channels. Second, you layer it through transactions, companies, and countries until the trail is nearly impossible to follow. And finally, you integrate it back into the legitimate economy as real estate or luxury assets. At this point, it looks completely clean and you can enjoy it openly. Now, it is worthy of note that money laundering at scale does not happen without institutional complicity or negligence. The global financial system has structural features that actually facilitate money laundering. For example, shell company secrecy. In many jurisdictions, it is possible to register a company without disclosing who the real beneficial owner is. And without knowing who actually owns the company, it is impossible to know whose money is moving through it. The UK historically was one of the most permissive environments for anonymous shell companies. Other places like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and Delaware in the United States have all served as major shell company havens. Now, Hush Puppy's story is the Nigerian case study for all 3 stages in one clean arc. The FBI called him one of the most prolific money launderers in the world, not because of the fraud that generated the money, but because of the sophistication of the system he built to clean the money. 11 years and 3 months in a United States federal prison just for moving money. And the reason you needed to understand this today is not academic, it is practical. The money mule pitch is real. The person who asks you to just receive money and send it out for them is also real. The person who loses their bank account, their reputation and their freedom just because they helped someone they thought they could trust, that is real. And understanding how this works is your protection against being used in someone else's operation without even knowing it. You know it, so nobody can use you for it. And also, the next time you see a lifestyle on Instagram that does not add up, you now have a very specific framework for thinking about that question. because sometimes the answer is exactly what it looks like. Now, this has been the Clarity Podcast. I am Angelo, and if this episode made something click, please share it. Share it to a friend, share it to a group chat, or send it to someone who has been approached with a suspicious money request and did not know how to read into it. This is the kind of clarity that helps protect people. See you next week, and until then, think clearly.